Okay, we have about 50 people joining us so far on the live. Um, so we're ready to get started. It's 12:05. I think that's given us enough time to get started. So I want to say welcome to everybody. We are very excited to start this series. This will be a three-part series with in partnership with the Museum of Durham History and Preservation Durham. So both organizations had events planned in March with John Shelp, our local street historian. But of course they got canceled because your health is important to us. It's more important that we preserve the health of the people in the community. So we decided to create a virtual event so that we can still have our presentation and provide and bring Durham history to you while you're at home and being safe. So again, I want to welcome you all. My name is April Johnson. I'm the Executive Director of Preservation Durham, and we have Patrick Mucklow. He is the Executive Director of Museum of Durham History, and we also have Street Historian John Shelp, and he will be creating a presentation. He will be presenting his presentation to us today. This is a live Q&A, so please feel free to, if you have questions, message us in the comments on Facebook, and we will get those questions to you during the presentation. Remember that we have 3 live events on today, of course, February 9th and February the 16th. I'm sorry, I said February. I'm still in February. April 2nd, 9th, and 16th. So join us at noon, at lunchtime, and we will continue this conversation and hopefully entertain and educate at the same time. So Patrick, do you have any words? Would you like to introduce?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, April. My name is Patrick Mucklow. I'm Executive Director of the Museum of Durham History. I want to echo what April said and say we're really excited to be doing this. And personally, I'm excited to work with Preservation Durham and John Shelp, old friends of ours. And so in times like this, I think it's really great to be able to collaborate with these folks. This is a critical time in our world's overall health, as April mentioned. And locally, we want to do our part to serve to the best of our ability. And we want to continue to serve the community. And once we're on the other side of this pandemic, the education and cultural organizations need your support, and it ensures that we will be here, like Museum of Durham History and Preservation Durham will be here through this pandemic and after this pandemic, so that we can continue to serve. So we would love for you to be able to donate to the organizations, either through a give button on one of our websites or through Facebook. We'll be accepting donations. And with that, I will turn it back over to John to get this presentation going. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, April. And kudos and gratitude to both Preservation Durham and the museum for joining forces and pulling this off while so many of us are staying at home. So we're going to begin our journey on Old NC-10, Old Highway 10. This postcard shows the highway on the Tennessee-North Carolina border. Why are we starting here when we're going to be talking about Durham for the next 3 weeks? Because Old NC-10 is the backbone of Durham history. It's the top of the ridge. Most of the postcards we're going to be looking at over the coming weeks are at or near the ridge that separates the Cape Fear from the Neuse, the ridge where the railroad tracks go. Old NC-10, in a nutshell, is Main Street. That's the first highway that went across the state. Hillsborough Road, Main Street, and on to Raleigh. So buckle your seatbelts, let's get started. Next, please. This is Bennett Farm. In fact, that road you see in the front of the postcard, that is the old Hillsborough Road. That is NC-10. So tobacco history starts here because this was the largest troop surrender of the Civil War, and afterwards all these Yankee soldiers were around town and they emptied the warehouses down by the railroad tracks by Durham Station, went home and immediately started ordering more tobacco from Durham Station. And that's how the business started to grow in this town, to go from a railroad stop to a major industrial city. So at Bennett Farm is a unity monument, and it's 2 columns. One is made of stone from the north, and one is made of stone from the south. And when it was dedicated, the United Daughters of the Confederacy objected to it because they felt that it was a monument of defeat. All right, next, please. This is Duke Homestead, and I love these postcards. I mean, these are all hand painted. The colors here are beautiful. This is where the Duke tobacco empire started, in a barn right here at Duke Homestead. And just to put it in perspective, this went from a single barn to a family controlling 90%, controlling the manufacture of 90% of the cigarettes in the world. Factories here in Durham, factories in Reidsville, North Carolina, Richmond, and other locations started right here at Duke Homestead. In fact, Duke & Sons was one of the original members of the Dow Jones Industrial. That's how important tobacco became. All right, next. This is the Washington Duke building at Trinity College. And let me quickly say, all that writing on there, that is because to send a postcard with writing on the front only cost a penny, and to send a postcard with writing on the back cost 2 pennies. And so a lot of people wrote their notes on the front of the postcard to save money. This is the Washington Duke building on East Campus. It was built in 1892, and a crack in the bell tower caused the delay of Trinity College to come to West Durham. It was a big deal because Trinity College almost went to Raleigh. They were being recruited like you would recruit Amazon today. They almost went to Pullen Park, but we pulled in at the last minute land and money, and they changed their mind and came here. And it was important to Trinity College because Trinity College was struggling. They were facing bankruptcy. They were 5 miles from the nearest telephone poles. They were out in the country, and the college was struggling. They needed to find a better place to grow and get bigger as a university. So they finally came here to West Durham. So next. This is the old East Campus entrance. And it's actually, if you look closely, this is not the original entrance to East Campus. So this is the entrance to Trinity College. Looking down in the fountain you see there, that fountain, that's the crane that you see at Duke Gardens.
Now, John, is that entrance still there, the way it looks like that?
No, it's moved over. So the entrance today is over to the right, closer to 9th Street. So a couple things, if you look closely at this postcard, you can see the Stag Pavilion, which is still there, and you can see a statue in the middle of the entranceway way down there. That was the old Washington Duke statue. Now that's where the sower is. So the sower, Johnny Appleseed, sowing seeds, that statue is on that pedestal. So the entrance was moved farther to the right when they got a bunch of money from Buck Duke and rebuilt the campus. But that down there is where Teddy Roosevelt stopped his train to praise Trinity College for its stand on academic freedom, when a professor, John Spencer Bassett, said that other than Robert E. Lee, Booker T. Washington was the most important man to come out of the South, and all the white supremacist groups tried to get him fired. The Trinity College Board of Trustees voted to not fire him, and that was an early example of academic freedom. So Teddy Roosevelt stopped his train right there. That's right there on Main Street by the Smith Warehouse, and he praised the college for the Bassett Affair, and he also said, "Gentlemen, as I came in, I felt that I was entering a football game with all the bells and whistles going off, because all the cotton mills and all the tobacco factories in town were blowing their whistles when the president came in." All right, next postcard. This is a cool old postcard of the earliest buildings of Trinity College. So again, back in 1892 when this started. There's an oval there. You can see the shape of an oval there that you can still see today. Those are buildings that were eventually taken down and moved to Kittrell College. Kittrell College was an African-American college north of Raleigh. But what I really want you all to look at here is in the back of the postcard, you'll see some vertical posts and a grandstand. It's a small grandstand. That's about in front of Baldwin Auditorium today. So Baldwin Auditorium today, you see a grandstand way back there made of wood. That was a leftover from the old horse race track. And this was a Blackwell fairgrounds and horse racing. So horse racing was hugely popular back in 1892, late 1800s. And that grandstand was used for early baseball games. So that was the baseball diamond, using the same grandstand from the horse race track. And they eventually took down that grandstand and used the wood to build the Arc. And the Arc is one of the oldest buildings on East Campus. And it's where Duke played his very first basketball game against Wake Forest in the Arc. It then for many years became a dance studio. And that, when she was a student with the American Dance Festival, is where Madonna took dance lessons. All right, next slide. This is the Durham Bulls. They played their very first game ever against Trinity College in 1913 in front of that grandstand on East Campus. People talk about 1902. Those were the tobacconists. Those are the Durham tobacconists. They played in the ballpark over in East Durham on Driver Street. Durham Bulls, first game, East Campus. And you see the Bull Durham in the back there. The Duke family really pushed advertising. They were one of the first families to really push advertising, and billboards everywhere. I mean, you can buy postcards from all over the country that still emphasize Bull Durham on the postcards. But even at Yankee Stadium, there was a billboard. And right there in the corner, there was a fence by the billboard, and that's where the pitchers warmed up. And that's where the term bullpen comes from. All right, so next. This is a cool postcard because it shows the old and the new. It shows you where the old buildings and the new buildings were next to each other. So on the right, you see ACOC. Well, it was ACOC until a couple of years ago. They took that name away because ACOC was a white supremacist. But there you see ACOC on the right, which is still standing. And then in the back, you see the buildings that were moved off of East Campus to Kittrell College, north of Raleigh. All right, next. Getting a little feedback, April.
Okay.
Okay, so this is a postcard that shows what didn't happen. This tower was never built. So some of the best laid plans. But another example of that is Washington Duke, who was about to put up a statue dedicated to enslaved women who supported white families during the Civil War. And he was gonna put it right over there near, kind of in the front of campus. And Aaron Moore and John Merrick, leaders in the African-American community, approached Washington Duke and beseeched him not to put up that statue and instead to use the money to build Lincoln Hospital. And Washington Duke agreed to that. All right, next. All right, here we go. Julian Shakespeare Car. Julian Shakespeare Car is the most important person in the early history of Duke University. No one is more important than Julian Shakespeare Car. Even when Trinity College was back in Randolph County and they were facing bank loans that were due, Julian Shakespeare Car signed the bank notes guaranteeing the loans be paid off so the banks didn't call in their debts. He saved them from bankruptcy. This is all William Boyd's book about the history of Trinity College, a Duke historian writing this. Carr was a member of the KKK. He was a white supremacist. He donated money to white supremacist groups, including those groups that were behind the coup d'etat in Wilmington. And at the same time, he would donate money to Black colleges. So it was complicated. But in donating money, I went to a lecture in the old Carr building at Duke about Carr. He was complicated in that he would donate money to Black colleges, but he would then get himself invited to give the keynote address at the graduations and tell all the graduating students in the graduation ceremonies that the slaves were happy when they worked on the plantation. So that's Julian Shakespeare Car. His house today is basically in the backyard of what's now the new Durham Police Station on East Main. That's where his house was, Somerset. All right, next building, next postcard. This is the Carr building. on campus until just a few months ago. This was the Car building. And this is part of the quad that was the first use of the money from Buck Duke's big donations of 1924, $24 million. So this is the Car building, and I just want to show you the postcard that this image is taken from. All these postcards, by the way, are being donated to the North Carolina collection at the Durham County Library. But I just want to read you this one postcard because I love it. It's a young student, September 1934, and she's writing her parents. So she's just arrived on campus. I can, of course, read this without glasses, but I'm just putting on the reading glasses to make it look dramatic. Dearest mother and daddy. First of all, I love that beginning. Dearest mother and daddy. I'm all unpacked. The room is fixed up. It looks so nice. I had a very nice trip down. My cold is well. I met a lot of people I knew on the train. I think Jean Maxwell is a little homesick. Not much, though. It's nice having a radio in the room. There's a good program on now. So I love that. That's the old quad designed by Julian Abel, who could not come visit his work because he was African-American architect and was not allowed on campus. All right, next slide. This is the Car building on UNC's campus. So this is a little bit interesting. Julian Shakespeare Car is the only person to have a building named after him at both UNC and Duke. He attended UNC, he was on the board of trustees of the UNC, but he was a big supporter of Trinity College, like I said, saving it from bankruptcy, and certainly that they were gonna fail in the panic of 1893. So listen to this. You can bring this to your next barbecue, when we can have barbecues. A UNC grad saved Duke from going under. So just take that to the bank. All right, so this building, the Car building, is right near the old well on campus, and it's still staying, and it's still called the Car building because there's rules against changing names around public schools. All right, the next postcard. This is Baldwin Auditorium on East Campus, designed to echo the library at the University of Virginia. Beautiful building, not expected. This building was not supposed to be built here. The original plans, when Trinity College got $40 million, was to build north. They quietly started buying land north of East Campus. So going up to Markham, Green Street, Knox Street, Englewood, Club Boulevard. They were going north. They were quietly buying houses up there. And the neighbors found out. And what did they do? They said, well, here comes, this big bucks coming to buy our houses. We're going to jack up the prices. So the university administration stopped buying houses, kind of went underground, and quietly bought the Rigsby Farm instead, where West Campus is. So think about this for a moment. Had Duke succeeded in their original attempts, you would have taken, the West Campus map and the East Campus map and line up the two quads, and the quad going up to the chapel would go right up through Walltown, right up to Walltown Park near Northgate Mall. So the Duke Chapel would be up near Northgate Mall, Duke Hospital would be over in Trinity Park, and Cameron Indoor Stadium would be near White Star on 9th Street. It would have been a very different university, a very different feel if Duke University had been built into the city instead of into the forest. But the plan failed. They regrouped, and they had to close off the quad. And to close off the quad, they built Baldwin Auditorium. All right, next postcard.
John, I have a question.
Yeah.
With the auditorium, was there any type of homage to UVA or Monticello, or was that just an architectural design of the times?
Not that I know of. Again, this is Julian Shakespeare. This is Julian Abel, who designed this, who of course was the architect who also designed West Campus. I don't know if there was ever stated publicly that he was, it's echoing UVA's library. This is Georgian architecture with the brick, very much like UVA's campus. I do know that there are requirements if you're going to graduate from Duke. And I'll just be brief, but one of the requirements is you have to climb the dome. Another requirement is you have to go through the tunnels underneath Baldwin. And the third requirement is to enjoy an evening with your partner in Duke Gardens. All right, quickly moving on to the next slide. This is Duke Chapel. And again, another example of hand painting here on the postcard. And I love it because it looks like Duke Chapel is in the Alps. So they bought the Rigsby Farm. When they stopped buying land up into Walltown, they bought the Rigsby Farm. And by the way, Walltown is named after George Wall, who was a custodian who came with the college from Randolph into Durham, bought a house just north of Trinity College campus. That street was originally called Wall Street. In fact, there was a Wall Street Baptist church on Wall Street. Today, that street is called Onslow. So the Rigsby Farm was huge. It stretched from West Campus, all of West Campus, up to including Irwin Mills. So some of that was sold off earlier for Irwin Mills on 9th Street, and some of it was sold off later for West Campus. But you can still see the Rigsby family cemetery in the Iron Dukes parking lot next to the football stadium. But that's the old, that's where the old Rigsby farmhouse was. All right, next. This is Duke Gardens. Beautiful. It was a dump. In fact, I have a friend who's a volunteer over there who's collecting glass bottles and displaying them for folks to see. But it was a dumping area. The mill village stretched, for the mills on 9th Street, stretched from Duke Gardens to Monuts. That was the mill village. And when Duke bought out the mill houses on what's now Central Campus, they took a lot of the granite curbs, some of them still with red paint and yellow paint, and put them down along the pond as a walking path, as stepping stones to go around the pond. So if you go to Duke Gardens when you get a chance, and you look at those stepping stones, you will still see stepping stones of granite made with a painted red and painted yellow across the tops. All right, next. This is Wallace Wade Stadium, the football stadium that was the first, actually the first facility to start operating on West Campus was Wallace Wade Stadium. And this is important, bring this to your cocktail parties or on your Zoom with your friends. Other than Durham, Pasadena is the only city to have hosted the Rose Bowl. So it was 1942, right after Pearl Harbor, 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor. US military said no large gatherings on the West Coast. Duke was in the Rose Bowl, offered to host. It was a huge deal. Had a Rose Bowl parade, had to borrow bleachers from NC State and even UNC to fill out the stadium with more people. Pouring rain. In the end, Duke lost to Oregon State. And I did meet the grandson of Wallace Wade. He contacted me out of the blue to help him find his grandfather's headstone at Maplewood Cemetery, which, by the way, says nothing about being a coach, nothing about Duke. All it says is it's U.S. Army. That's all it says. He left coaching to go join the Army in World War II. But he told me that his grandfather had a bit of a temper, and his very first job interview was with the University of Kentucky as a young football coach. And he went and talked to the athletic director and the president of the university. And they said, thank you, young man, you can wait outside. We'll call you in when we've decided. He waited 1 hour. After 1 hour, he knocked on the door and walked into the president's office, president of Kentucky, and said, gentlemen, if you cannot make up your mind whether you want to hire me or not in an hour, I don't want to work for you. Number one. And number two, every time I play you in football, I'm going to beat you. And sure enough, every time Wallace Wade played Kentucky in football, whether with Duke or with Alabama, he beat Kentucky every single time. Okay, so next postcard. Any questions coming in? Let me know. Just interrupt with questions. This is kind of a famous building on West Campus. This is, of course, Cameron Indoor. But what many people may not know is that it was built with football dollars. Football dollars paid for Cameron Indoor because Wallace Wade was winning bowl games. They took the proceeds from those winnings and built Cameron Indoor. Now, basketball at Duke, going back to the Arc, where Duke played its very first game when campus stadium was in the old, what's now the dance hall on East Campus. Cap Card lived on Minerva across Buchanan. It's not Buchanan, it's Buchanan. He lived on Minerva across from Buchanan, about 5 doors down from Wallace Wade. So Wallace Wade and Cap Card, who brought basketball at Duke, lived about 5 doors apart. I went to a yard sale on Minerva, and for $1, I bought this Bible. And this is the Bible. So I don't know if Duke is still doing this, but every graduate from Duke gets a Bible on the day they graduate. And this one is, graduation Bible presented to Helen Card. Helen Card is the daughter of Cap Card. So I have, for $1, I collect artifacts. I have the Bible of the daughter of the father of Duke basketball. Put that in a museum somewhere. All right. Next slide.
All right, John.
Yeah.
So the people in the chat said that there's still a slight delay. So for us, even though our delay is only about 2 seconds, it's still about a 10, I don't know how long, but they're saying that they're not catching up with you. So we may have to give a little pause.
Okay, well, I could start talking about, I'll say what I'm talking about, at least, so people know what I'm talking about.
Okay, it's showing now, so you can go ahead with this slide now.
All right, and you can always ask me a question if a question comes up at that time. We'll have an opportunity for that too.
Okay.
All right, so this is Duke Hospital. This was built in the early 30s. A lot of the doctors that worked at Duke Hospital moved to Durham's new automobile suburbs. So like Hope Valley and Forest Hills. Keep in mind, your first generation from, the industrial families like the Dukes and the Irwins and the Cars, they built their mansions near their factories. My theory, unproven, is that they wanted to, get electricity. But so you see these large mansions next to the factories near the railroad tracks. Their kids didn't want to live there. It was too noisy, it was dusty, the horses were scared. They wanted to move into neighborhoods like Trinity Park, nearby, but not in the shadow of the factories. Next generation, they moved out to streetcar suburbs, like the one that went out to Lakewood. More about trolleys later. And the next generation, they moved out to these automobile suburbs, like Hope Valley, like Forest Hills. So now we have this new Duke Hospital in the early 1930s. Those doctors are moving to Club Boulevard and to Forest Hills and Hope Valley, and away from closer neighborhoods like Club Boulevard. So what's under Duke Hospital? So I've talked to many mill workers in West Durham. Unfortunately, many of the mill workers generation, like the World War II generation, are passing on. But they told me that this was the old boneyard. You have your horses, you have your cows. What do you do when they die? You bury them in the boneyard. So that Duke Hospital was built on top of the boneyard. I think that was specifically told to me by Anthony Barini, who was about 92 at the time. But bring that to your next barbecue. Duke Hospital is built on top of the old boneyard. All right, so next postcard. This is the last I'm going to show of Duke before we move on. But I want to talk a little bit about Italian stonecutters.
Okay,
so,
it's showing. Speaking of Italian stonecutters, are you going to talk about, I heard that there was an Italian family. I mean, the stonecutters were an old family here in Durham. Do you know their name?
That's right. Marzocchi. So Giovanni Marzocchi was an Italian stonecutter who came to Durham from the Pennsylvania coal mines. A lot of the Italian stonecutters were working in coal mines in Pennsylvania. During the Depression, they came down to West Durham because they could get a job building Duke Chapel, Duke Hospital, and the rest of West Campus. So Giovanni Marzocchi his granddaughter contacted me out of the blue from Rome, and she's writing a book. She's writing a book about her family, and we ended up exchanging 300 emails, and I sent her a bunch of photographs. Her house, the Marzocchis lived on 6th Street. 6th Street is now Clarendon Street. They live near 6th and Club with a cluster of other Italian families over there on the edge of Walltown. And built the chapel, and after finished building the chapel, Irwin Mills hired Giovanni Marzocchi to work in the mills. Why? Because they wanted him on their baseball team. He was a good baseball player, and they hired him so they could have him on the Irwin Mills, actually it was called the Irwin Auditorium, baseball team, because they were determined to beat their rivals from East Durham. And so Giovanni Marzocchi is kind of like a Joe DiMaggio of Durham, who stayed in Durham. And we actually have that chapter from that book is actually on the Old West Durham website, if you ever want to see it. Thankfully, translated by an Italian student from Duke. So, but a lot of stonecutters stayed in Durham, like Marzocchi. Others left to go work on other projects that involve, stone cutting and stone masonry, like the Blue Ridge Parkway and the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. Right, so let's say goodbye to Duke and let's move on. I'm going to talk a little bit about Pinhook. Pinhook was an early settlement. Before there was Durham, there was Pinhook. And it's about a day's walk. Forget stagecoaches, forget Hollywood movies, walk. Most people back in the early 1800s walked. So a day's walk from the backcountry capital of Hillsborough to Pinhook, and then another day on to the new state capital in Raleigh. So it was a rough and roaring place. People would kind of, rest and relax, enjoy the local virtues, have a drink, get up the next morning and walk on. It was a rough and roaring place, Thomas Wolfe, in his book, Look Homeward Angel, he went to Chapel Hill. So he talks about going to this fictitious city, which was Durham, where university students would go off on a lark. And so they came to Pinhook and partied. And this was like, because you couldn't party in Chapel Hill, it was much more controlled. They didn't want a train station in Chapel Hill because it brought too many immoral aspects. And so they insisted the train station be at least a mile away, which is why it's in Carborough. But Thomas Wolfe talked about going off on a lark and coming to roaring Pinhook to let off some steam. So there's also, on the other side of town, Prattsburg. So before Durham Station, you have Prattsburg on the east and Pinhook on the west. Durham came later. All right. There's not a question. We'll go on to the next slide. Okay. This is Irwin Mills, 1892. So same year that Trinity College came. 1892 is by far the most important year for West Durham, and certainly one of the most important years for the history of Durham, because Irwin Mills was a huge employer. 5,000 people worked here. The mill village, again, stretched from Duke Gardens to what's now E.K. Poe School and Monuts. E.K. Poe is Edward Knox Poe, the namesake for the school, and he was the first manager of Irwin Mills on 9th Street, and he supported education, so they named the school after him. By the way, E.K. Poe went from high school, where they won many championships in football and had cheerleaders, to a junior high, to an elementary school. And when it became an elementary school, there was this big decision, what happens to the mascot, the Green Dragons, and they decided that E.K. Poe could keep the name E.K. Poe, and the Green Dragons would go to the new middle school at Brogden. So this photograph, it's kind of cool. This is taken from 9th and Main, and Main Street here going west, because it was by the mills, was a dirt road until 1977. Say that again. Main Street was a dirt road until 1977. This section in front of the mills, because the mills probably didn't want to pay for it. But in fact, when West Durham was annexed in 1925, for 10 years before that, William Irwin said, if you annex us, we're leaving. The city said, we're going to annex you, and he threatened to leave. In fact, he built a fake dam down on New Hope Creek off of Irwin Mills, where he had his hunting lodge by Hollow Rock, and said, if you annex us, we're going to build our own dam, provide our own electricity, and get around your taxes that way. So that's why, because Main Street was dirt, that's why US 70 business and old NC 10 had these funky turns going through West Durham. NC 10 came in Hillsborough Road, at Barn Supply it turns right onto 9th Street, and at Main Street it goes left into downtown Durham. That's why NC 10 does that zigzag, because Main Street was dirt until 1977.
Hey, John, we have a question.
Yeah.
Jerry Phelps asked, John, can you mention finding the graveyard between Main Street and Duke Hospital?
Yeah, so I got a letter in the mail. The mail is something you go out and get an envelope, you open the envelope and there's a stamp on it, you pull out a letter. That's what the mail is. I got a letter in the mail, and it was a guy in Tidewater, Virginia, who said, I can't find my father's grave. He's buried at Irwin Mills Cemetery. And I had no idea what he was talking about. This is about 25 years ago. And I went to one of my main, two of my main sources were three: Jim Wise, Bill Holmes of Ideal Sundry, and John McDonald. John McDonald of McDonald's Drugstore on 9th Street. I went to go see John McDonald, and we sat in the back of his drugstore and spoke for a long time. And he explained to me that Irwin Mills had its own cemetery. It had a health clinic, it had a gymnasium, it had an indoor pool, it had a baseball team, it had a zoo. Irwin Mills had its own cemetery. And so John McDonald told me where to find it. And he and I went out there, and then Bill Holmes joined me because it was owned by the Knights of Pythias. And finally Yarborough came, and we had some cleanups. It's a fascinating cemetery. It's woodsy feel to it, and it's like an oasis, a woodsy oasis in West Durham. It's not too far from what used to be called West Durham Lumber, Talbert's. And we've organized over the years about 50 cleanups, starting off with some elderly women who came in, whose families were buried there, and then eventually to make it sustainable with Duke students who were, fraternity looking for a project, or a group of students that were being punished for underage drinking would clean out the cemetery. But it's still there. We painted the fence, we planted February gold daffodils, we put up a sign, and it all started with a letter from Virginia. And also, by the way, there are 3 headstones there, dated 1929, 1930, 1931, of 3 little babies who died. And they were all made out of the Duke stone that's used to build West Campus. So those little babies, the theory is, were from families that were building West Campus that are buried at Irwin Mills Cemetery, Cedar Hill. Okay, where are we on the screen? What are we seeing?
The Irwin Cotton Mills.
Okay, the aerial view. Let's go on to the postcard, the aerial view of West Durham, because I can't see right now. So still in West Durham, this postcard is right near where I'm standing right now. This is an aerial view looking west. So if you look in the middle of the postcard at that dirt road going off into the distance, that's Hillsborough Road. What's not yet built is Greystone Baptist, is not yet built. But that's Irwin Mill number 4. So my house is over to the right on that postcard. It's an old parsonage for the West Durham Church of God, which was on Hillsborough Road. The ladies of the West Durham Church of God used to protest the sale of liquor on 9th Street. And then years later, the church moved out to the suburbs. They tore down the church and built the ABC liquor store. But today, looking at that postcard, you would see Harris Teeter and Station 9 Apartments in the middle of that postcard. But that's part of Irwin Mills. Pinhook would be over to the left. All right. So let's go on to the next postcard. There's not a question. Now we're going to start talking about an old gas station. You're going to see in a second. This is the Granite Service Station. Today, this is the BP at 9th 9th and Main. If you look closely to the far right of this postcard, you'll see St. Joseph's Church. That's St. Joseph's Church. And just across the street was the Union Hall on the second floor of a post office. And that's where a lot of the strikers would meet and get groceries during a strike because they needed to eat. And then just down across from the old bank, which is now Brugger's, Fidelity Bank of West Durham, which is now Brugger's, those are all mill houses, all along 9th Street. Those are all mill houses across from the Regulator, across from Dane's Place. Those are all mill houses. And right across from Brugger's was the home of Don Schlitz. Don Schlitz was a songwriter. And actually, he's in the news recently because one of his most famous songs is The Gambler by Kenny Rogers. So, know when to hold them, know when to fold them. Don Schlitz grew up on 9th Street, right behind this gas station. He also wrote a lot of songs for Mary Chapin Carpenter, and came to town a few years ago, and we talked. He's a very nice guy. But that's one of our songwriters. We also have a story. We'll talk about Tobacco Road next week, but we also have the story of Elvis Presley, and this is from a column that Jim Wise wrote in the Herald Sun, that Elvis Presley stayed incognito in a caboose at Irwin Mills when he was in town for recovery. So we have Elvis Presley, we have Don Schlitz. We're going to talk about Loudermilk as we move through the slides next week. Right?
Hi, John. There's another question. Leslie Nunnery asked, when did they tear down the houses where the Harris Teeter is now? Do you know about when the Harris Teeter area houses were torn down?
The houses are being torn down mostly by the church, Greystone. The Harris Teeter was part of the mills. So there was Irwin Mill number
Got it.
1 and Irwin Mill number 4. So there were actually 8 mills from Irwin Mills. In fact, if you look at this behind me, those are the 8 mills of Irwin Mills. There were 2 in West Durham, 2 in Coolamy, North Carolina, 2 in Irwin, North Carolina, and then 1 in Mississippi and 1 in North Raleigh off the Falls of the Neuse Road, off the Falls of the Neuse. So there were 2 mills on 9th Street, mill number 1 and mill number 4. So the Harris Teeter and Station 9 Apartments, those are, that was an old cotton mill that was in that postcard. Then for years, it was a parking lot that Duke rented, that Duke wanted to rent, and we asked them not to do it because we have enough Duke cars in our neighborhood, and Duke backed off. Nanka Hain, to her credit, backed off and didn't build a 500 space parking lot right there. But the mills, the 9th Street, Station 9 and the Harris Teeter they replaced old cotton mills. And I will quickly add that the Harris Teeter, they got their site plan in. They could have done whatever they wanted. They could have built this Harris Teeter just like the one up on Horton Road with blank cinder block walls and no windows. And we talked to the owner, who's a very nice guy, and he agreed to put in brick on all 4 sides, windows on all 4 sides, a skylight to the back. And that's an example of neighborhoods negotiating with developers to compromise and come up with a happy solution. Okay, so let's move on to this is the last slide, so ask questions. But I do have a couple things to say. We're gonna end this first week on a very, very small corner. This is a small corner store. It's still standing today. It was called Ralph's Produce. If you look real closely at the postcard and zoom in on it, the newspaper headline is about Jimmy Carter. This is probably around Halloween because there's lots of pumpkins there. So this is the corner of Broad and Markham across from East Campus. And this is, I'll end by talking about, this is the center of a microcosm of Durham history. So just to the east, you have the historically African-American blue-collar neighborhood of Walltown. Just to the west, you have the historically white, blue-collar neighborhood of West Durham, working the cotton mills. Cotton mills, mostly West Durham. Many in Walltown were working mostly in the tobacco factories downtown. And then just to the north, you have this kind of middle-class band of teachers and shopkeepers who live along like Englewood, a little bit of Knox. And then go another block on Club Boulevard, you have the bigger houses where you have the doctors and the shop owners. And then you go south to the railroad tracks and you have these a string of working class neighborhoods like Brookstown, Monkey Bottom, West End, Lyon Park, Crest Street, Hickstown, all working class, right along what's now the Durham Freeway, all taken out by the Durham Freeway. And then just past that, you have this large estate, 17 rooms, called the Maples, wraparound porch and a turret, owned by the Fitzgerald family, a wealthy African-American family that made the bricks in town. So the bricks you see in Irwin Mills, a lot of the tobacco factories downtown, are made by the Fitzgerald family. So within a mile of this Ralph's Produce, you have rich, poor, white, black, working class, middle class, wealthy African-American family, all within a mile of this corner. And I'll quickly add that there's a reason why the softball field is not right up on the East Campus wall. There's a reason why the new bougie dorm that Duke built across from Whole Foods is not up on the East Campus wall, because the neighborhoods negotiated with Duke to have a setback from the East Campus wall, and Duke agreed when the neighborhoods got involved. And they can't build anything too close to the wall. They can't put in any new entranceways into East Campus. They can't build a parking deck on East Campus. They agreed to a lot of things for East Campus rezoning. But that's where I'm gonna bring it to an end. We'll have some questions, if there are any.
Yes, John.
Yeah.
Yes, Jerry Phelps almost wants a little teaser and wants to know if there'll be talk about East Durham and the Crabtree Pharmacy in any of the future talks.
Crabtree Pharmacy, which is really cool. It's gone, but they made great orangeades. Yes, Jerry, thank you for your question. I will talk about East Durham. You know, East Durham and West Durham are very similar. They both had a Fidelity Bank. They both had a mill history. East Durham was, we're going to talk about this, just a teaser, was historically white in many areas. In fact, Few Gardens was the white project. But they had drugstores and pharmacies just like West Durham did. So yeah, we'll get into that, Jerry, I promise. We'll also talk about Marvin's Alley, the short little street that every house on that street with their shades drawn either was a liquor house, a gambling house, or a house of ill repute. So we'll be talking about East Durham for sure in our journey across Durham.
Hi, John.
Yeah.
Jenny Levine, you know Jenny, she's a big supporter of Durham history. She said this is fascinating. And she wanted to know how many postcards you have in your collection and how did you get them?
Durham postcards, I don't know, maybe 400 or more, but I also do goofy things. Like I'm trying to control myself, but I also have like postcards of other Durhams, like Durham, New Hampshire, Durham, Maine, Durham, New York, Durham, Connecticut, which have fascinating histories. I mean, Durham, Connecticut, who knew? A population of 7,300 people, and they host the largest agricultural fair in New England. Who knew? But I have a lot of North Carolina postcards and other Durham postcards as well. So I don't know, 800, I don't know, 700. It's growing and it's expensive. It's becoming an expensive endeavor because it used to be really cheap to buy postcards, but now they're becoming much more expensive. But it's all the documents have been signed. It's all going to the North Carolina collection at the beautiful new library.
John, Diane Thomas wants to know what is in the Ralph's locations now?
Sorry, Diane, I didn't mention that. High strung. And again, they're working with Tom Miller, the neighborhood's negotiated with the owner, very nice guy, to protect that building because it's a historic building and it was the site of a nationally got national coverage for a tree sitting contest where a guy sat in a tree in front of Ralph's Produce to try and set some sort of record for sitting in a tree. But that building is protected. Thank you to Diane.
Christy wanted to know, John, how did you become so interested in vintage postcards?
I grew up in Washington, D.C. I was kind of surrounded by history. I grew up in the city. I remember as a kid being in my backyard at night and the sky was dark, but it was on fire because Martin Luther King was assassinated that day. I used to, when I was a choir boy at the National Cathedral, I used to play in the tunnels under the cathedral. And, you kind of just grow up with history around you. I get this house and I find out that it's a parsonage for the West Durham Church of God. And all the stories are involved with this house. And it just kind of grew from the house to the mill village around here, to the mills on 9th Street, to Duke, and its amazing history, to Durham. So it kind of grew out. Postcards, yeah, they just, I collect postcards. I collect dishes. I have some Duke plates, spindles and spools from the cotton mills I collect.
Nice, thank you, John. I don't know if I have any other questions now, but we had about 100 folks on the Museum of Durham History's live. And then we did the watch party version on Preservation Durham's Facebook page. So we had just under 150 people watching. So
cool.